Good morning. We'll be starting up here in about 3 minutes. You can go ahead and open up your pods, get ready to do the polls, all that fun stuff. You're going to want to open up both the Q&A pod so you can send us questions and the chat pod so we can send you some details, handouts, and stuff like that. Okay, a little more than 1 minute out. We'll be getting going here on what is a little chilly this morning walking in. I saw 0 on the temperature this morning. As long as it's not Kelvin, I'll be okay. Okay, we'll give folks about another 30 seconds to log in just because top of the hour, and then we will get started. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our uh, penultimate webinar for 2025. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the Cornell Local Roads Program. We're your New York State LTAP Center. And we're going to get started with our session on road and street legal issues. Okay, we will be doing polls, and we'll talk more about that as we do our welcome. Um, Just as a reminder, we have webinars all through the winter. This is a list of the webinars through February. And as a reminder, you'll notice there's a couple of backdated ones. We do record these and post them on the web. It takes a week or a little more sometimes to get them posted, but you can watch a video and at least, if nothing else, get the handout that has links to the resources that we talk about in all of these various webinars. We also have our spring workshop series coming out, and we're doing everything from drainage to pavement maintenance, but I did want to highlight that we're doing our rights and responsibilities class, which is very much focused on what we're talking about today in a lot more detail, some of the powers and duties you've got. And we're going to be in 4 spots around the state in the spring, a couple of times in March and a couple of times in April. Now, if you haven't been on one of these webinars before, bottom left corner, you'll find your audio settings. You'll open up your chat because that's where we'll be dropping in, if you haven't already done so, your links for today's handout, which is essentially an outline of what I'm talking about and some resources, as well as links to the polls, so you have to type those in. That's one way, though, we send you stuff with the chat is disabled coming in. So if you want to send us questions, open up the Q&A pod, and I will actually be asking you to send some things via the Q&A during the course of our hour together. And I may ask you to raise your hands now and then to answer certain questions. Now, this particular class is worth 1 professional development hour here in New York State. Again, only the person who's registered gets that credit. If you want to do a group of people, you would have to do more. If you can't get into the polls, by the way, don't worry about it. We can use the Q&A to get your information. This counts as a course in New York State, though that's not as critical as it used to be for getting your continuing education. If you're from outside New York State, I always say you can check with your LTAP center, but this particular class is focused a lot on New York State laws, so you might want to just push on that particular one, but you could check with your LTAP center. Now, before we get started, there's a caveat. I'm not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV. So this is the engineering perspective, things I've picked up over the years, quite a few of them. No, not as far back as the picture behind me. That's the Letchworth State Park when there used to be a canal running along the side of it in the early 1900s. But yeah, so just a caveat. Really should know your municipal attorney and check with them or your association before we go too far. And before you have any problems, check with them. But we can hopefully help you resolve problems before you have to deal with the council. Now we're going to do a quick welcome. We're going to talk about a few things. We're going to do a poll to do that. We're going to do polls throughout the hour together. This is pollev.com / David or PE. And again, if you've opened up your chat, uh, that should be linked in there. In fact, by magic, I'll actually ask, I think it's Michelle's doing that today for me in the background. I'll ask her to drop those links in one more time so folks can just click on the links and don't have to memorize it. And give thanks to both Jody and Michelle for helping make my life much easier. Now, we are using materials from some of our workbooks, including the class I mentioned, Rights and Responsibilities. We also have a class on liability, reducing liability for highway and public works departments. And of course, there is the reducing liability in running your highway department classes that might be useful as well. So there's lots of good resources. Those are linked in your handout. You can also get copies of things. If you cannot get to the links in the handout, or you can't get the handout itself, just send an email to Michelle that's listed in the chat, or just send an email to our main address, clrp@cornell.edu, and we can email you a copy of the handout as well. Now, who do you work for? This helps me figure out some of the details I might be talking about later. Do you work for a town, a county, a city or village, state or federal, tribal, MPO, some kind of authority like the Thruway Authority, consulting firm, contractor, or are you just working for a living? Okay, I'll get rid of the weekend this time. Let's see what we've got. So we've got quite a few town, quite a few county, quite a few city village, quite a few state fed, and some consultants. I really like this mix. It's a good mix. Good to see. Okay. So now that I know where you work, what's your job? Are you an administrator? Are you the highway superintendent, the deputy superintendent commissioner? Are you an engineer, a planner, a field crew? You're on the board either as the supervisor or straight board member. You do whatever the boss tells you to do, or none of the above. Let's see what we got. So we have a board member, and it's got a few supervisors. I like that. That's good to see. Okay. But most of your engineers, probably because you want those professional development hours. I can't really blame you there. And again, if you can't access the polls for some reason, throw it in the Q&A and I'll look and just sort of put that back into my brain. Now, how long have you been in your current position? Now, those of you who are about to take office starting January 1, you could go ahead and click on the less than 1 month. I would just like to know if you're brand new or just about to start as a highway superintendent. I suspect that number will go up on January 1 when the town highway superintendents take office starting in January, but we'll see. And again, we got a good variety of folks ranging from 20 plus to less than a month. My goal today is to teach you one thing you can take home and use, and hopefully we'll succeed there. And of course, the last thing I like to ask is, where are you from? You get to click on this one. You'll get to click on a couple of other pictures during the course of the session. Where are you from? So we have all over the state. Oh, I like to see it. That's good. Long Island, Hudson Valley, Western New York, up along Lake Ontario. Okay, cool. Thanks very much. This helps me. Let's get started. Now, let's talk about the law. Now, the law is an interesting thing, and if you've ever read Oliver Twist or just watched the musical Oliver, you know that people, well, they say it's no excuse if you do certain things. You need to know about the law. And that can be a challenge, as the character Mr. Bumble says. And I won't repeat what he says, but you might want to read the book. It's a fun one. Or you can go watch the musical if you prefer. But the idea is the law controls a lot of what we do. Okay? And it talks about things we do from a liability standpoint, but also requirements, our powers and duties, our rights and responsibilities. So let's talk about an example of a place where the law kicks in. Okay? And in this particular case, we're going to talk about traffic control devices. That was last week's webinar, okay, the MUTCD, but there are standards out there for signs, stripes, and signals. And those are the law. But the law isn't always exactly what we think it is. What the law does, if you think about it, it starts with our constitutions. Okay, we have the U.S. Constitution, we have the state constitution. That's actually the fundamental principles that follow with everything that we do. And then there are laws passed by legislatures and or Congress that overrule those particular rules. Okay, now from those laws, there's regulations, and those regulations come into play in a lot of different situations. We'll talk about a few of them over the course of the day. And of course, agencies also might write policies. Those policies usually follow the regulations to give us a little information, and then you might see a guide or guidance to help you make sure you pass the policy without having to read the entire thing. And then we also like to have agreements or contracts between groups, organizations, even between governments, and those usually follow through with some kind of guidance or policy, but they have to pass the muster of the law. So let's think about what does this mean in the terms of our friends, the traffic control devices, okay? So we obviously have the Constitution, we the people, and you'll get that song stuck in your head. At least every time I do, we the people, I think of the preamble from the Constitution, the old Schoolhouse Rock. But there's going to be we the people. And then there will be, from that, there will be laws that are passed. Okay? Now, in terms of laws for highways here in New York State, highway law goes back into the late 1700s, early 1800s, depending on which sections you're looking at. But it's old and it follows through a lot of things. Now, those laws change over the time, and you need to know where those can be found, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's say that you wanted to write a regulation upon those laws. So there's a set of rules for putting signs up, the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. Now there's a national manual that's passed, and each state needs to adopt that manual, but can do supplements to it. And that's what happens here in New York State. There's a supplement. So currently, for traffic signs, that's a regulation. It's the National MUTCD and the New York State Supplement. And by the way, it's a supplement that's actually a little out of date. The state's working on an update. And that can always be a challenge with any kind of regulatory environment is how quickly do we update and get those things changed. So in this case, you actually have to follow both a new and an old document, and that can be challenging. So where does that leave us? Well, if you're a local agency, you might want a policy on, say, for instance, children at play signs. Children at play signs are not in the national manual, so you couldn't put them up if it was the national manual, but New York State does allow them in certain limited situations. But you, as a local agency, might want to set a policy on whether you actually have children at play signs. So watch this. Raise your hand if your agency allows children at play signs. Raise your hand if you allow them. Okay? I'm going to get two. You're going to get to do this twice. So watch this. Magic hands in the air. So a few of you do. So now all your hands are going to get lowered magically. Okay? Now raise your hand if your agency does not allow children at play signs. Okay? So a few more of you have that. The rest of you either don't have a policy or you haven't thought about it, which is fine. The point is, agencies can set policies in certain situations, and we'll talk about when and where they can do that. Now, there may be guidance that's out there. We put out a traffic sign handbook, and that traffic sign handbook is in the process of being updated once the state's got its supplement ready, and we'll be printing some in 2026. But that's guidance. Those guidance documents help you follow the rules, but they're not the actual rules. You have to go to them, in this case, the National MUTCD and the state supplement, before you use them. And then finally, you might have an agreement or a contract. In this case, it's a 284 agreement on when to spend money, maybe, or it's an agreement on who actually puts up the signs. Some counties, that's actually what's done. Okay? And yes, someone I see in the Q&A has put up a thing about insurance companies advise the town not to put the signs up, the children at play signs. And it's a debate among the administration. Having a policy can reduce your liability, and we'll come back to that. And it's always a challenge that we have to deal with. Now, before we can figure out what laws we've got to worry about, we need to know what we're responsible for. So we're going to be talking a lot more about this in a webinar coming up in January, but let's just give ourselves a starting point. Put in here what are the responsibilities of a highway or public works department. See what y'all put down. And you should do this for your own agency. This really does help you figure out both what you need to do from a legal standpoint, but also a liability standpoint as well. Okay, so you got safety, you've got snow, you've got stormwater. You have to have consistency. You got to worry about trees. You got to worry about signs, permits, pavement maintenance. Make a list of all the things you have to do and think about a little bit how you're going to pay for them because there's rules about all that that need to be followed to meet the fact that, and you put it in there, I like that word, consistency, communications, things like that. Okay? So I would recommend anybody do that. And if you're one of the people who's about to start on January 1, take your oath of office, do your normal agreement, and then sit down and maybe with your crew, figure out what is it that's the highest priorities and what is the primary responsibility. And we like to say here, we're trying to help everybody get home safely on good quality roadways. So safety and good infrastructure really do matter. Now, if you are with a town, and a fair number of you were with a town, make sure you have one of these. This is the Office of the Town Highway Superintendent, known as the Red Book from the New York State Association of Towns, or NIOT, as they're currently abbreviated. If you don't have a copy of this, get one. If you're a member, you can get both an electronic copy and a paper copy. I like having both in a lot of documents because how you search for things, but have a copy. If you work for a county, you should have a copy of this book because there's a lot of overlap, especially in certain areas like roads by use, which we'll come back to. There is a similar book for villages available from NICOM. It's not directly applicable, but it's similar. And again, make sure you've got good documents, and some of these are in your handout. Everything comes back to also there's something called case law. Okay. Now there's the law itself, and we'll come back to some examples of this, but there's the law itself. But what happens is the law is written and there's some confusion. So somebody sues somebody else, or they ask for an opinion from the Attorney General's office, or even the Comptroller's office. And what will happen is someone will write something up, and those opinions will get published, or the case will get settled by a judge. And those summaries get put into what's known as the case law. And those can actually not supersede, but clarify when there's confusion about a particular aspect of the law. And we'll come back to a couple of those in just a little bit. But you need to know where you've got a copies of McKinney's Consolidated Laws of New York State. Okay? Now, raise your hand if you have in your office, or you know right now where you could go grab and find the McKinney's Consolidated Laws for Highway. Raise your hand. How many of you could raise your hand right now and go, "Yep, I know where a copy is." Yep. Okay. Absolutely critical if you got a question to go look at that case law. The law itself doesn't give enough details in some cases. Okay. So you're going to want to have that. If you don't have a copy, that's fine. The county clerk will have a copy. You can always go down there, and there are literally like 100 of these black books covering all the laws, but make sure you have the highway law portion at least. And you can always get it under the clerk's office to look at others. And a lot of departments will have them. And make sure you talk to your friends and colleagues about that. Now, as an example, there are rules out there about fixed objects in the right of way, and there are case laws about those objects in the right of way. Okay? So there's a mailbox. Somebody puts a mailbox in. And there's rules that the post office puts up about what you can and cannot do. If you put something up in the right of way, or even let it outside the right of way, you can incur liability. Okay? So let's just ask ourselves, where's the edge of the right of way? So here I've got a picture. Get to click on this one. Where's the edge of the right of way? And I'm going to assume for a second it's a road by use, and I'll explain that a little bit more for those who don't know. But where do you think the edge of the right-of-way is if it's a road by use? Let's see what people click on here. Okay. And so it's all over the map. People, everything ranging from the edge of the pavement to in front of the fence line or the tree, or maybe going further out some fixed distance. Okay. Right-of-way is a really interesting problem because you both have some responsibilities within that right-of-way, but also you have some powers, things that you can do within that right-of-way itself. Okay? Now, in this particular case, if I was being asked what the right-of-way is, Probably. Let me get my pen to work here. And let's see, I gotta pick a color I think can be seen. See if it'll draw today. Some days it doesn't like to draw on the poles. Yep, it's not drawn today on the poles. Well, I would probably actually say the edge of the pavement, maybe in front of that tree, but we'll talk about that here in just a minute. Somebody asked, is the consolidated laws available electronically? Yes, with a subscription. Lawyers can access that. Yeah, the case law is available online if you have a subscription. It's a subscription service. You can actually look at the laws themselves, the text, easily. In fact, that's linked in the handout. But the consolidated case laws, you'd have to go to a legal search. Now, what is the right of way? Well, again, when we do the full class, we'll get into a lot more detail. But here's the rule of thumb. Right of way, you have two choices. You either have a piece of paper, most commonly a deed or some kind of easement, should be filed, hopefully at the county clerk's office. There are some limited cases where it might be at the town clerk's or the village clerk's office, but it has to be a piece of paper or it's by use. Okay? Those are your two choices. Now, if it's a case of a deed that has to be filed at the county clerk's office, and you can go down and find those deeds. And those, by the way, most counties, I'd say probably 80, even 90% these days, you can find them online, though you might have to pay a fee to access them. You can actually see the deeds, and that deed will tell you the right of way. It will tell you what the town or county or village or city actually owns and what the right of ways are for the agency and what the landowner owns. And that deed would then control what the right of way width is. There might be an easement, and that easement sometimes is attached to the deed, sometimes it's not, though we recommend that you might want to do that because it's easier to find it, because then it's at the county clerk's consistently. And that easement could be a permanent or a temporary easement. Now, temporary easements, those might not file. Here's the key with an easement. If it's something you're going to be back again to do, you absolutely need to make sure it's a permanent easement. If you're just cleaning up some ditches, well, that's actually probably a permanent easement because you're widening a ditch out. But if you're just dumping material into somebody's yard, yeah, it's probably temporary. Cutting down a tree, if you cut the tree down, you're not coming back, that's probably temporary. But if you're going to be putting in some plants, that might be permanent. If you're not sure, ask. It's better to ask. This is one of those cases where it's definitely not better to ask for forgiveness and permission. But what I really want to focus on, because this happens probably about 90% of town roads in New York State and over half the county road system, and oh, by the way, village streets, are by use. Okay? Now, here's the thing. By use means actually used and maintained by the municipality, whether that be the county, the town, the village, cities, so a little different because it comes back to your charter. But the idea is actually used and maintained. So in this particular case, there's a ditch back there. Okay. Now this one I should be able to draw on. Okay. So actual, they're maintaining it. There's the backside of the ditch. Okay. If they can show they've got active maintenance, they probably have that right of way. And I'd love to say they absolutely have it, but there's case laws that can change these things. The case law for roads by use is one paragraph in town highway law, one paragraph in village law that are very, very similar in text. 27 pages of case law summaries in the book. Okay. So there's a lot of variation, but actually used and maintained. Okay. So certainly the pavement, certainly the shoulder, and certainly at least the foreslope of the ditch. Backslope, again, there's been cases. The key here is document. If you go out and you inspect and say, we don't need to do something, document how far out you expect to go. If you clean the end of a culvert pipe, document it. You might gain that right of way. Okay. If you don't document it, then it's going to come back to possibly who said this and who said that. And we don't really want to get into that particular situation. Now, one thing people tend to do, they tend to like to go down to the tax office and they look at the tax maps, and the tax maps show a right of way. And they may show what's known as a three-rod right of way because the law talks about the town may open the road up to 3 rods. Please don't do that. Because what happens is the case law has said, well, Yes, that's what the law says. The town has that right, but they don't have that right without paying for it. So if you widen the roadway out, you can go up to 3 rods legally. You could take it by eminent domain if there was political will, but you have to pay for it. Otherwise, it's a taking constitutionally. Okay, so just keep in mind the tax maps are just help you figure out who the deed owner is. They're not there to define the right of way. You've got to look at a deed or you've got to define it by the use and the maintenance. Okay? And there has to be public use. A driveway to one house is not public use. Driveway to two houses is probably not public use. Where does it become public use? Again, you got to go back to the case law. Best talk to people, work with them, communicate. Okay? Now remember, it takes time to do this. So it takes about 10 years to gain the right of way. It used to be 20, now it's 10 years of actual work, but it only takes 6 years to lose it. So here's a good example. You see these trees? Those trees have grown up in front of the fence. You might have been able to argue if you'd been mowing it and cutting the shoulder and stuff like that, that you had a right of way to that fence line. But once you let trees grow up that are a safety hazard, i.e., about 4 inches in diameter, the right of way is now probably the front of that tree and the front of this tree. And yes, it may not be perfectly straight, but it's what you've used and maintained. And by letting those trees grow up that are a safety hazard, then you get a situation where you actually can lose that right of way. Now, someone in the Q&A asked a great question. That's a true, good point. I hadn't talked about that. So let's just talk about 3 rods. Rod's an old English measurement unit. A rod comes back to a chain, and I won't get into the details, but a rod is 16.5, that's a point, not a comma, 5 feet. So 3 rods is 49.5 feet. It's not 50 feet. And there are case law where they cut down a tree because the front of the tree was just under 25 feet, but it was over half of 49.5 feet. In other words, half of 24 3/4. Yes, a few inches difference, and there's case laws on that. So it's actually just less than 50 feet, and it's from the center line. Okay? So right of way, um, and in terms of how much it's worth, well, it's worth being able to maintain it. It's not an economic thing, it's more of a rights and responsibilities thing. And how much to purchase it would depend where you are and depend on what the value of the land is and what the use of that land is. And it could be very little, it could be a lot. So keep that in mind. Now, back to our agreements and contracts, just keep in mind, whether it's roads by use or the other things that we're going to talk about, they all fall into each other. So the reason that the case laws have said you can't just widen the roadway out, even though the state law says 3 rods, is because the Constitution guarantees you can't be deprived of your property. And so if you take somebody's land without providing recompense, it's a constitutional taking. And so keep those things in mind. It all goes back to the Constitution, even the agreements and contracts that we have. Now, what other powers and duties do we have? Or as we changed the name of the workshop to rights and responsibilities, with great power becomes great responsibility, right? Isn't that what Spider-Man's uncle says? Okay. And we already have talked about all the responsibilities that you've already got. So keep in mind those responsibilities that you've got. And remember, there may be reports that go with all of these to document things. Okay, so keep that in mind as well. So what reports do you have to do annually? What are you required to do legally on an annual basis? Okay. Okay, we have crash reports. Okay. We have stormwater reports. We have the highway inventory, which is required for your CHIPS funds. Possible maintenance records. You have to, by law, have to do a machine inventory. Okay. You have to do payroll and voucher for your employees. You think about certain reports that you've got to do both on a monthly and annual basis. These are requirements under the law. Okay. And these are important so we have documentation. Even going back to that roadway by use problem. That's part of the problem we run into is people aren't documenting what the width of the road is or where it runs. Someone put over in the Q&A that pavements are not in the center line of the roadway. Well, or center line of the right of way. Well, they might be in the center line of the right of way, but depends how the right of way is defined and the road's defined. A lot of deeds read to the center line of the road. And if the road had shifted and nobody documented it, guess what? The property line may have actually changed. The center line of the road may have actually changed. And boy, that can create all kinds of problems. So document, document, document. And one of the most important things we have to have, especially at the town level, it's a requirement, but it's good for everybody, is, you put it in the Q&A, you beat me to it, Joe. And that is our friend, the 284 agreement. Now, this is an agreement with towns and the town board to spend money, okay? Now, it's not the entire budget. It's the budget for general repairs and permanent improvements, okay? And it has to be signed by at least 3 members of the board. It does not have to be the supervisor. Well, excuse me, majority of the board, because some boards are 7-person boards. But it has to be signed by a majority of the board and the highway superintendent. And technically, until that is signed, you cannot spend money for those activities. So you can plow snow and cut brush, and that's about it. So you need to have that agreement. We recommend that agreement is signed at the very first meeting. So coming up in January, sign that form, get it filled out, even if it's not complete, because that is just an agreement. It's not a contract. It can be changed and should be changed as events and emergencies occur. A lot of agencies will actually put their permanent improvements down they plan to do for the year in big writing and more detail, and then just a general total amount of money for general repairs, and then modify it as you get closer to the actual construction season. Perfectly acceptable way to do it. And again, it's a communication tool. And even if you don't work for a town where it's a requirement of law, it's still a really good idea to have a list of what are you doing for the year. So everybody's on the same page. So let me ask, do you have an agreement with the board? Um, yes, a signed agreement, 284 would be an example. Just something that's submitted by you. Again, that's done by a lot of counties, cities, and villages. You could have an informal agreement. I don't recommend that, but some people like to have that. I like to have something more, little more detailed. Um, the risk of no is then everybody's not quite sure how the money is being spent. And then there's a possibility that people will go, ugh. If you're not sure, when you get home, figure it out. And coming up in January is a perfect time to reestablish and get some agreements in place. And again, for counties, villages, and cities, there's no legal requirement you have to do it unless the board requests it, which they can do. But it's not a bad idea to explain everything to everybody. Okay? Now, speaking of communication with people, there is the Freedom of Information Law, FOIL. Okay? Now, okay, the official name on it is the Freedom of Information Act, so it becomes FOIA. You'll see that abbreviation all the time. Foil sounds better because, you've been foiled, curses, foil again. But the idea is if people ask, you have to provide them with records, okay? So you can't just hide things at a governmental level. There are plenty of exceptions, okay? But things such as what work was done on a roadway, what piece of equipment and how much it cost, those are all foilable activities. How many employees you've got, the total budget, those are all things you can have. Discipline records for employees, of course, that's protected. Information about potential lawsuits, that's protected. Discussions about contracts, that's protected. But once the contract is signed, the actual contract, that's very much a foilable activity. And again, we'll spend a lot more time on that when we do the workshop in the spring, but just keep in mind, ask yourself if you would like to be able to, as a citizen, be able to see the documents, it probably is foilable, with some exceptions dealing with personnel matters, contract matters, essentially lawsuits and things like that. Okay? Now, one of the ones that comes up a lot is the daily log. Now, the daily log is technically not foilable, except if you want to use it to defend the municipality, now it becomes foilable. Okay? Because it's essentially a personal record. And there are ways to protect that. But once you put it into a court case, the whole thing becomes available. So my recommendation, if you've got something you want to later on might use, like a daily report, transfer that information from your daily log into a daily report, that becomes the foilable activity. So then you can keep your opinions, your thoughts, things like that. But you should keep a daily log, even if you think, hey, I don't care if it's foilable, but keep a daily log. So what should be included in your daily log, whether you decide to keep it protected or not? What should be included? Let's see what you guys come up with. The weather, absolutely the weather. One of the most critical things is the weather. Where you were working, what crews you had, yeah, what equipment was involved. Okay? If you do maintenance and protection of traffic, someone put in the Q&A. Yeah. Now again, you might put some of these down on more formal documents that are filed and then become part of their overall record. But again, you want to write these things down. Okay? So, for instance, this is an example of the kind of things people will do if you have to go to court. They'll ask you questions, and they're going to try to see if you've got good memory. Well, we all don't have great memory, but if we write it down, we got a better chance because then you can go to the record and don't have to rely on the old noggin. Okay? So let's just raise your hand. I'm going to make this simple. How many of you can tell me what you had for lunch last week? Raise your hand if you can tell me what you had for lunch last week. That's Tuesday. A lot of you should be able to, I hope. Okay. Quite a few of you. Okay, now I'm going to lower all your hands. How many of you can tell me what you had for lunch last year? Yeah, no clue. Okay. If you don't put it in writing, you don't know. I mean, people do like to say, I even saw the comment, oh, if I put too much down, they'll catch me on it. And there's lots of times you hear about that in New York City where they go write everything down and, oh, they're going to get sued because of it. 99 times out of 100, that information is actually going to help you, not hurt you. Okay? If it's well documented and you're not doing something that actually would get you in trouble. Okay? Don't hide behind, oh, I didn't have a record. Because if you get caught on something, the lawsuit will be much, much worse. So write things down, be consistent, and be ready to realize things will change. And then that helps you, by the way, if you're having to deal with emergencies. Okay? If an emergency occurs and you document what you've got, it really protects you from a liability standpoint. And oh, by the way, there's legal requirements for emergencies as well. And again, if we had a whole day, we'd talk about who has certain responsibilities. So in an emergency, can the town highway superintendent close a road in an emergency? Raise your hand if you think a town highway superintendent can close a road in an emergency. So about 20 or so of you are saying yes. Technically, no. Um, Actually, yes. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you come across a crash, like in the lower left corner. The town superintendent wants to shut down the road. From a safety standpoint, absolutely. But if that road needed to be closed, like in the flooding situation or in a major snowstorm event, technically it needs to be the head of the government, town supervisor, county legislative commission, the mayor, or the chief of emergency response or police. Those are the people who have that technical power. So again, there's the technicalities, there's the legal requirements, and then there's what we're actually going to do. And sometimes I know those conflict. But keep in mind those chain of command and goes all the way back to those rules, the laws, and the Constitution. But emergencies are an interesting thing. The best thing with a good emergency is to have a plan in place, to have communication with each other, and think about what the legal requirements are in that case. Because what we don't want is liability and risk. Okay? We don't want to do things that put everybody at risk because, like it or not, people like to sue the government because they think we have these infinite deep pockets, which isn't true, but many people have tried that and succeeded in getting lots of money. Um, and so it's something we have to think about. Now, from a liability standpoint, what are some ways we could reduce liability? How can we go out and reduce the risk that people have? What can you do? Well, obviously communicate. Yeah, a great answer. Yeah, the more communication you've got, the better off you're going to be. Have a plan for regular maintenance and know what you've got. Yeah, you're going to want to be proactive on things. Okay? You need to follow the standards. Okay? Which means you might have to have policies and have established procedures. I'm a big fan of good policy. Please be careful with your policies, though. A bad policy can be trouble too. But have a good policy. Delineate your hazards. Have a plan, follow the plan, okay? And you're going to be in pretty good shape. Now, you may want to make sure you've got your insurance up to date. That can help you quite a bit. Those insurance companies can also help you figure out where you've got problems, both on the road and in your facilities, okay? And if I have to choose, always put safety first. You can't go wrong if you go safety first and educate, not just yourself, but others, and then the public, and understand what you've got and document it. Yeah, great answers. But then I drive down the road and I see things like this. And I'm like, ugh. I I like trees, but once you decide a tree is dangerous, cut the whole tree down. Okay? Right flush, nothing above the surface. Anything above about 4 inches is a safety hazard. And if you cut that down and leave it, your liability goes through the roof. Okay? You have almost no protection because people are going to go, well, why didn't you cut it down? Well, it's hard or it's difficult. Those aren't defenses you're going to be able to win in court. Now, realize that part of this comes back to something called notice. Notice is essentially a way of saying you are on notice that you've got a problem and you need to fix it in a reasonable period of time. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that reasonable period, but what do I mean by notice? Well, there's two ways, three some people define, but there's ways to get notice. One is a notice in writing. Somebody submits in writing to the municipality, the town, county, city, or village, I see a problem. Okay? And then constructive notice. Okay? Constructive notice means it's obvious. It's been there so long that you should know about it, or if it's done by the agency. And as an example, somebody put in the Q&A, what happens if a stump, like I showed, has a safety barricade? So let's go back and look at that picture real quick. A barricade, would the barricade stop a vehicle? Probably not. The barricade essentially is you saying, hey, we know it's a problem. Do we do sometimes short term put up some barrels as a delineation? Yes, but long term, if you leave that, your liability is there like, hey, we knew we had a problem bad enough to put up a barricade, but why didn't you cut it down? So again, that's that concept of a reasonable period of time. So, if someone sends you a notice about this bump that was done, it doesn't meet the Americans with Disabilities Act, do you have to fix it tomorrow? No. But if you left it there for 4 or 5 years, way obvious that's long term. You got to fix it. Okay? Now, what is the length of time? It depends on the activity. How much risk is it? How much safety is involved? Always think about safety. But if you build something, by the way, you are under notice. It's a form of constructive notice. Now, there is one other way to get written notice, by the way, and that is a phone call or communication from a police agency. That's considered written notice. So if you get a call from the state trooper or the sheriff or the chief of police, you're on technically written notice. It's a little bit more stringent in terms of how quickly you need to respond. Now, notice, it varies depending on municipal type. Towns will need to pass a local law. Counties have very limited changes they can make. Villages, surprisingly, get full protection automatically for snow and ice activities and for general liabilities. Has to be in writing to villages. And city, you'll need to look at your charter. Again, if we had a whole day, we talk about this. We spend quite a bit of time talking about notice. I do also want to make sure we talk about some other issues that come up from a legal standpoint. One of them is financial concerns. The reason we have rules for this is so, again, back to that communications issues and your budgets and your spending and your accounts. And things need to be spent in the proper account. Okay? So for villages, most of your funds are going to be general funds. But for towns, you're going to have your town highway. And if whether you got a village or don't have a village will be a DA or DB account, and counties have a D or DM account, so they keep their equipment separate. Heck, you might have a capital projects fund. Here's the key with accounts. Once the money goes out of the general fund, it has to stay in that special fund with some limited exceptions. And those limited exceptions are generally short term within a given fiscal year. Okay? So I have an email sitting in my inbox that I'll be replying to right after this webinar. Somebody wants to, a municipality wants to spend money that's in a special fund, a highway fund. Okay? They want to spend some of the reserves because you can create a reserve tied to the highway department. Okay? If it's tied to the highway department, it's got a D with it. It can only be used for highway cost. It can't go back into the general fund. It has to stay in that particular area. Okay? Otherwise, you could just rob Peter to pay Paul. The whole point is these are special accounts. So if the town highway is running short, you can get money from the general fund. But if the general fund is getting short, you can't get money from the highway fund, again, with the exception of short term until the end of the year. You could borrow the money, but you got to pay it back. And the reason for this is, again, transparency, so everybody's on the same page. And that also means you need to have a purchasing policy. Okay? That means you need to know what your direct purchase is. When you can you just go out and buy something? I need a few nuts to take care of some bolts. It's small enough, I can probably just go buy it. Or when do I actually have to go get quotes over the phone and write them down? Or actually written documents back? Or even bids? Okay? So these are all things, and of course there's exceptions in every single case. But raise your hand if you have a purchasing policy. Raise your hand if you have a purchasing policy. Please, most of you raise your hand, please. That's good. A lot of you are raising your hand. Every single agency should have a purchasing policy. If you don't have a purchasing policy, you need to go find one. Absolutely critical. Okay? And there are some exceptions to competitive bidding that are out there. See if you guys can list two of them for me. Again, looking at the time, we can only just get a few things, but there are exceptions to competitive bidding. Let's see if you're on good. Emergencies, but even then, use best practices. Yep. If you're using a state contract, you're actually not, that's not technically an exception to competitive bidding. It's just an alternative for bidding. You can actually use a state contract or piggybacking with another agency. Okay. By saying emergency, but there's one other that I'd like to see if you guys catch that's used all the time by municipalities. Piggyback, yep. State contracts, emergencies. Municipalities can do leasing. Okay. Leasing and professional services are two of the most common ways, exceptions. Okay. Now, in terms of your bids, if you're above the limit, you're going to have to do competitive bidding. And in New York State, General Municipal Law 103 describes public works at $35,000 and purchases at $20,000. So if it's more than that, you have to go out to a bid. Okay. Now, one of the things that I've talked about earlier is what can municipalities do? You can't lower those numbers. Excuse me, increase those numbers. You could lower them. A municipality could say, we're going to use competitive bidding down at $5,000. But you can't go above those numbers. The state rule supersedes any local law. And by the way, if there's a federal law, it would supersede the state law unless it's more restrictive. Now, in the case of public works, the challenge is it public works or is it a purchase? If you're buying a truck, that's a purchase. If you're having a culvert installed, that's public works. Keep that in mind. We'll come back and ask a question about that as we move on. And so let's now put everything I've talked about together. And again, in our hour, we're going to put this all together and just ask a few. Somebody put in the Q&A, when would those numbers adjust for inflation? Downstate does not have higher numbers. The state law, general municipal law, those numbers have not changed in now almost 30 years. So something to think about. Those numbers are set. And there are places that can have higher numbers. Education actually has a higher number for purchases than general municipal law. Again, something to think about. Now, in terms of keeping this all together, just keep in mind that whole pyramid of where things fit. And make sure you have for writing, for liability, for legal issues, standards and policies. Okay? Now, Do you have a written standard for your roads and streets? Yes or no? You actually got yes, you use the state standards, no, you're not sure, or none of the above. If you do none of the above, I do ask you to put in the Q&A what that means. You have written standards. That's great. It's good to see. You really should have written standards. They protect you from a liability. They're great communication tools. And by the way, if you have written standards, there are written standards that aren't as wide, not as much work that needs to be done. In fact, I'm pointing out one here. This is for low volume roads, and we have some on our website. They're linked in the handout. So you don't have to build quite as big a structure for your roads or your streets. If you don't have that, you may be held to a different standard, which you may not like. Okay? In terms of hard hats, okay? We're big fans of hard hats. Here's an example of one where the hard hat did its job. Guy was doing trimming a brush. The brush snapped, tree hit us in the head, punched a hole in the hard hat, but didn't punch a hole in him. He walked away essentially without any serious injury. Yay, hard hat did the job. Time to replace the hard hat. Here's a case of some, hate to say it, engineers who were going, well, you know, if a big rock comes down, it will kill me. Well, yeah, but the little pebbles that were still coming down could have given you a concussion. So if you're out there where there's a chance of something, put the hard hat on. But let me ask you, from a legal standpoint, who can set the hard hat policy? And you can select all that apply in this case. Crew leader, highway official, elected board, contract, state law, federal policy. Yeah, a few of you are getting it. Yes, everybody has the power to set policy. Okay? What happens is as you go up this chain, they can set a more restrictive policy and they can hold to it. Okay? So the crew leader can say, I want everybody wearing a hard hat 100% of the time. Okay? That's the most restrictive. But let's say the crew leader says, you only have to have a hard hat on when you're working on jobs where there's a crane. Well, the highway official can say, no, 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 I want it every single time you're uh, on a construction site. And then the elected board can say, no, I want it every single time you're out of the vehicle. A contract might have requirements in it. In fact, there are if you're doing federal work. The contract might actually supersede that. Because again, now we're talking about legal requirements. There may be requirements from PESH or the Department of Labor that describe the color. Those can set the color of the hard hat. And of course, if there's a federal policy. So again, think about that list as we go up down the chain of command. Okay? Now, speed limits. Speed limit, in this case, an area speed limit sign, a little faded, 25 miles an hour. In New York State DOT sets the speed limits for most town roads, not all, and county roads. Okay? Villages and cities can set it using the guidance from the MUTCD and the Vehicle and Traffic Law. But let's say that you want to do something different. Can a local board pass a law that supersedes a state or federal law? Yes, because of home rule. Yes, if more restrictive. Yes, with caveats, or no. The answer is actually yes, if more restrictive, but restrictive is in the eye of the beholder. Home rule does not allow municipalities to supersede a state or federal law, and that speed limit rule is a good example. Okay? Unless you are a suburban town or have above 50,000 population, big town, the state DOT sets the speed limit. Okay? So you can't lower the speed limit. And so in this particular case, the more restrictive goes in the other direction than you might think. So you can't lower the speed limit. Okay? In fact, you can't change it at all. So there's actually also yes with no caveats. That answer sometimes comes into play. So it's not a pure yes, it's not a pure no. It depends upon the situation. General rule of thumb is if more restrictive, or in some cases, the caveats would control. So keep that in mind. And that's where these purchasing policies come into play, where you need to set a policy, but there are certain lines you can't change, such as the bid limits. Okay? Now, this is one that comes up a lot. I want to make sure we're on the same page on this. Which would be a public works bid item in this list? We have dump truck, we have installing a culvert, installation of a heating system in the barn, delivery of salt, or hiring an engineer. So which one of these would have to go to competitive bidding if it was above 35,000? And which one would, excuse me, which one would have to be competitive bidding if it's above 20,000? So keep that in mind. There's a difference between the two. Okay? So a new dump truck is not public works. It's a purchase of a thing. So in that case, you could buy a truck as long as the price was under 35,000. No. It's once you hit $20,000, you have to go out to bid to buy a truck, which means pretty much you got to go out to bid or use state bids or piggybacking to buy a truck because I can't think of a truck you can get for under 20. Okay? So even though the price might be 32, you're going to have to go out to bid because it's not a public works activity. Installing a culvert, absolutely. Installing heating system, that's a good question. If you're just buying the items and you're going to do a lot of the installation, it might actually be technically an item. If you're going to have them install it and do some maintenance and this fancy stuff, it probably is a public works. If you're not sure, ask. Salt would not be a public works item. That's a thing. You're getting a thing, and even though there's a delivery cost, that would be something if it was over 20, you'd have to go out to bid. And then hiring engineer, well, that's a weird one that's on the side. And remember, that's one of those exceptions. It's a professional service, and you can use a RFP or best value proposition to get that done. Now, in terms of shared services, all keep in mind whenever you're doing shared services, there's those legal requirements. They all come back into play. So what kind of things do you do for shared services? Give me some examples of that. There's at least two, I think, almost I see all over. Trucking, yeah, another town helps you truck materials for a paving job or bringing in salt or something like that. Yeah, okay, that's a good example. What else you got? Plowing, yep, that's probably the most common. We plow. We have shared service agreements with the state. Maybe you borrow somebody's sewer cleaner. I see that in the Q&A. Even pavement maintenance. Again, there's lots of shared service agreements, but remember at the end of the day, if you're municipality A, you have the primary responsibility. So if someone else is helping you, it's still your duty, your non-delegable duty to do certain activities. So make sure the agreement is written that way and make sure everybody understands whether you're paying for it or whether you're sharing and trading services and document it so that everybody feels you're on the same page. Do you need a contract? Well, some would say yes. Some would say a good agreement can help. I just say make sure you have good communication so everybody knows we're being treated fairly. Now, right of way. Remember right of way. Deeds or easements or by use. So in this particular case, the right of way here, it's not defined by that utility pole. Utilities do not define the right of way. It's what's been used and maintained by the municipality. So it may actually only be the width of that pavement, the gravel, and maybe the width of the mower, and maybe not even that. Okay? So in this case, you get to mark it again. Where's the edge of the right of way? This is in a village. Villages have the same rules with one minor exception, and that has to do with municipal control, private use. But again, case law can help you there. And again, we're all over the map. There's a sidewalk there. That sidewalk does not define the pavement or street right of way. The sidewalk is considered separate. If you've got good documentation that you maintain that, however, for drainage purposes and to keep the road as, free from things, you might get that sidewalk up to the fence line. Certainly not beyond those trees, though, because again, that's a safety feature. Good news is utilities, they're not going to change your right of way because they're a man-made item put in there. But if someone is in your right of way, make sure you have an agreement with them for things like that. But you can use that legal power, by the way, to help you. So in this case, site distance at a corner. What's your options for site distance at a corner from a legal standpoint? Not the engineering side, just from a legal standpoint. Okay. Yeah, you could do some trimming. The town board could set a law or a local ordinance that requires it to be trimmed by the locals, but it has to apply to everybody. You could do signage. Okay. You could put stop signs up in every direction short term. There are things that could be, you could technically even take land, but you need to think about what you need to do from an engineering standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint as well. Same thing with mailboxes. What do you do about a mailbox? They look nice, but boy, I don't want to hit it. What are your options there? And someone put over there, and I'll read this to you while you're answering the mailbox question. You have a dead tree outside the road that lean towards the road. What do you do? Well, first off, you need to notify the homeowner you have a dead tree, and make sure you talk to their insurance carrier so they're aware you know they have a dead tree, and that usually does a lot of good to take care of it. If you feel it's a safety issue, you have the right to take something from a safety standpoint. But again, don't have but another few minutes to talk about that. Um, and yes, utilities do not define the right of way. Yeah. And generally, no, you don't have to maintain. You don't have to, but you can maintain. But that comes back to that roads by use issue. Okay. But again, great answers for the dangerous mailboxes. Keep in mind the legal stuff and keep in mind the other assigned duties. This is the one last thing I want to make sure we're on the same page. Highway departments have certain things you're supposed to do by law. But what happens if you get other duties? You're legally allowed to be given other duties at the town and county level, and of course, DPWs at the village and city level. You get to do everything. So there may be other duties that are assigned as well. The key message there I want you to take home, and I'm going to let you go, and that is if you are assigned an additional duty that's not a highway duty, that can be done, but you need to document whether or not you can do it safely, efficiently, and effectively. Okay? If you can't, you need to document that you can't. And this is the big key, make sure if they're asking you to do something that's not a highway function, it doesn't come out of the highway budget. I wish I had more time, but it's the end of the hour, so I want to remind you about the rest of our webinars. Hopefully we'll see you next week. Some of you on asset management. Then we'll be taking a break for the holidays. We'll see you on Basics of Good Road in 2026 or at one of our workshops around in the spring. Again, you can always send us an email. You can send it directly to me at david.orr here at cornell.edu or just clrp@cornell.edu or go to our website. And with that, everybody have yourself a great day. It's a little cooler this morning, but it's supposed to be in the 20s and maybe even the 40s tomorrow, though. They're calling for some snow. Be safe out there. Take care. Bye-bye.